Hello and good morning. My name's Mei Fong, and I'm the Director of Strategy at the Center for Public Integrity. And I'm so pleased to be your moderator today at the Commonwealth Club's program, which is talking about the myth of Chinese capitalism. And I'm really pleased to be here today with my friend Tiff Roberts, who is the Mansfield Fellow at the University of Montana, a brilliant journalist and a writer, and the author of a new book, which is called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism: The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World. Now, this is a critically important book to understand how surging income inequality and a very unfair social welfare system and rising social tensions are blocking China's economic rise in the world and complicating the already troubled relationship we have between China, the United States, and the world. Now, both Tiff and I have been longtime journalists in China, and him for Business Week and myself for the Wall Street Journal. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with him and on a topic that's very important to us. But before we jumped into this conversation, one final note. If you have any questions for myself or Tiff, do please post it in the YouTube chat box, or they can be forwarded to me during the program. So welcome, Tiff. It's great to see you again.
Well, thank you very much for such a kind introduction, May. It's great to see you virtually again. Unfortunately, we're not doing this in person for obvious reasons, but wonderful to see you here today. And thank you to the Commonwealth Club for giving us this opportunity. I'd like to start by talking about how I came to write my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. And in order to do so, I have to take everyone back to quite a few years, about 20 years, to the year 2000. At that point, I had been in China for about 5 years and been covering the business story, as you mentioned earlier, mainly working for Business Week full-time at that point, and had been spending a lot of time for that reason in the big cities of Beijing, where I was based, and Shanghai and Shenzhen and places like that. But that year, the year 2000, I did 2 cover stories that took me to a part of China that I had never been to before. And the first of those, you can see pictured here, was called China's Wealth Gap. And this cover story was looking at the already then fast-growing gap between the coastal regions of China and the interior. I went for this reporting to the province of Guizhou in southwestern China. Then, and unfortunately still today, one of the much poorer parts of China. And just a little context to that, to the reporting for this story and the topic. At that point, we'd seen a couple decades since Deng Xiaoping opened the economy and started reform and opening. And we'd seen rapid growth, but much of that concentrated on the coasts. So there was a policy by the then leader, Jiang Zemin, called Develop the West, which was an effort to try to address that already strong growing gap between the coasts and the interior. That same year, again, 2000, I went back to Guizhou for a second cover story. You can see it pictured here for Business Week, The Great Migration. I was looking at the already hundreds of millions of strong migrant workers that were, in response to this unequal development, were leaving their homes in places like Guizhou and going to the coast to work in the factories and then factories and construction sites, mainly at that point. This young gentleman, then young, pictured here on the cover of Business Week, is named Mo Rubo. And he is someone that I met then for the first time. First met him in Dongguan in Guangdong province, where he was working along with millions of other migrant workers in the export-oriented factories there along the Pearl River Delta. And then later was to meet him many times in his hometown in rural Guizhou province. So I focus my book by looking really at 2 places in China, representative of both the wealth gap and the tremendous growth that you and I both experienced and wrote about in our years in China, May. And the two places on the right, you can see the village that the Moruboa, who you just saw, hailed from, called Binghuacun, in the southeastern part of this province of Guizhou. And on the other picture is of a typical factory scene. This happens to be an SUV factory in Guangzhou, Guangdong, just up the river from Dongguan, where I met Moruboa, and another big factory cluster in China's Pearl River Delta. This is another picture of Moruboa. I believe he was 21 when I met him. He had already left his village for probably 5 years, and he had been a true migrant. He had worked in Shanghai. He'd worked in a city called Ningbo, a big coastal city not far from Shanghai, and then worked in a number of different jobs around Guangdong before I met him, where he was working, as you can see here, as a welder in a Taiwanese-owned electronic components factory in the city of Dongguan. Another picture of Moruboa. Here he is pictured with his then girlfriend, who also a migrant worker, working in a different factory there in Dongguan, comes from a different part of China, but also a province that is traditionally been a big source of migrant workers, the province of Henan up in the north. And so they met there in Dongguan. Another person that I spent a lot of time with is pictured here, also surnamed Mo. Most of the people in this small village of Binghuacun share the same surname and are distantly related, which is common in the smaller villages in China. Her name was Mo Meichuan, and she's here in the bright red vest jacket. I had met her in Dongguan outside the factory she was working in several months earlier, and then when I visited the village of Binghuacun, met her again. She had returned for two reasons. One was to help her parents with the rice harvest. And the other one, which was probably far more important, was to renew her identity card. At that point, and again, we're going back to the year 2000, migrant workers in China were very vulnerable to local police authorities. And one of the things that could happen to them was if they did not have all the proper documentation on them, and that included an up-to-date identity card, they could get picked up and put into what they called black jails, then effectively held for ransom, where they would have to pay several months of their salary, equivalent to several months of their salary, in order to get out. So something like this had happened to one of her distant relatives in the village there. So she had gone back to make sure that she wouldn't get in trouble with the local police because of this expired identity card. I visited again Guizhou for the first time in the year 2000, visited the village of Binghuacun that year. This was actually before China was to enter the World Trade Organization, which came 1 year later. But at that point, people in China already knew that they were going to, that China was going to enter the World Trade Organization. These key bilateral agreements had been negotiated between the US and China in late 1999, which was a big part of my early reporting in China, covering China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So even in this little village, they knew that China was going to, about a year later, enter the World Trade Organization. And I remember talking to the village party chief, and he was very hopeful that with China's entry into the World Trade Organization, and frankly, with after talking to a foreign journalist, that this might bring investment to his village. And he was very hopeful that they would get a vegetable and fruit processing factory so they could move beyond their then reliance on subsistence agriculture and remittances from the migrants, the young people that left the village and became migrant workers. So China enters the World Trade Organization. We know the broad dimensions of what happened. It brought literally tens of thousands of new investors into China. Factories sprung up even more throughout the Pearl River Delta, up near Shanghai and the Yangtze River Delta. It created countless new jobs for these young people from the countryside. And we saw China's economy grow very rapidly, and the living standards of its people go up dramatically as well. So, sort of jumping forward to the present, and I will wrap this up shortly. So WTO, as I said, brings tremendous progress to China, undeniable improvement in living standards across the board. It brings infrastructure throughout the country. This is a picture here of rural Guizhou, not far from that same village of Binghuacun that I write about in my book. This is a very recent picture. The expressways, high-speed rail was built throughout China, including in remote places like Guizhou. And this indeed did help local economies. If you look at this picture very closely, you can see there's a gold and red billboard along the expressway. And the gold and the red, just a side note, is a clue that this is Chinese Communist Party propaganda. I can't read it right from here, but I think it was a Xi Jinping slogan. So we saw infrastructure built throughout the country, and also, of course, propaganda reached deep into China. So bringing us to today, as I said, undeniable progress. China has set some centennial goals. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded in 1921. And for that celebration, China has announced that they will end absolute poverty. And as some of you may have seen recently, they have basically achieved that. So they've met that goal. They also, as part of the centennial goals, announced that they would double GDP and also double disposable per capita income between the years of 2010 and 2020. And even with COVID-19, which slowed the economy, it looks like they're going to achieve that goal as well. So very impressive. I'd like to highlight quickly, however, another statistic, which says a lot about the challenges that still lie ahead for China. When I first visited Guizhou in 2000 and wrote about this effort to narrow the wealth gap, a statistic that I always heard about from local officials was the fact that rural incomes on average were about 1/3 that of urban incomes. Well, that proportion is still roughly the same. So despite all the years of effort and the real growth in incomes, there's still this about 1 to 3 gap between those people from the countryside and those people from the cities. At the same time, we've seen an explosion in wealth inequality in China. And Thomas Piketty, the noted inequality expert, has found that the wealth gap in China is roughly comparable to that in Russia, which might come as a surprise to some people. Even more worrisomely, it's growing at about the same speed as that as it's growing in Russia, which is also very, very fast. So as I argue in my book, I think that there's a couple of legacy policies in China that explain why this gap still exists today. And probably, almost certainly actually, more important than any other policy that still exists in China today that has a very negative influence on income growth in rural China is something called the household registration policy, or in Chinese, the hukou. Now, this is a policy that was set up during the Mao era in order to keep rural people working then in communes and therefore having adequate, cheap food for people in the cities that were supposed to carry out the industrialization of China. So this policy still exists today. It has changed in that it used to bar people from rural China from coming to the cities. Obviously, that has been completely tossed out. So now we have maybe 300 million people, migrant workers that have left the countryside and come to work in the cities. But what the household registration policy still does today is tie every person's access to social welfare, access to healthcare and education to the place where they were born, or actually more specifically where their parents were born. And what that means in effect for China today, or China's people today, is that some 1/2 the population of migrants and their relatives in the countryside are receiving much lower quality health care. They have to get it, they're supposed to be getting it from rural China. And also their children are receiving far inferior education as well. It also is the source of this really a human rights tragedy in China today, which is what they refer to as the left behind children phenomena. And that is the reality that up to 100 million young people, the children of migrant workers, typically do not travel to the cities and live with their parents, where their parents work, but stay behind in the countryside because of that restriction on where they can get educated. And many of them today live in large impersonal boarding schools and are not receiving very good education there, and also face some really sad both physical and psychological issues related to growing up in these boarding schools. Typically, they see their parents once a year. Quickly, the last policy that I do talk about in my book, which I think is also key to explaining the continuing existence of this inequality, is the dual land system. It is, again, a policy that originated many years ago under Mao. And what it does in effect is ensure that while people in the cities are able to buy and sell their apartments, and they've done it with great gusto and become very wealthy in many cases doing so, most rural people, and that includes the migrant workers, are unable to actually buy and sell their property at market rates. One last picture. This is one of the more recent visits I had to Mo Rubo. Unlike many migrants, he has opted to stay in Dongguan. Many migrants now are returning to their villages to try to reinvent themselves now that China's factories are automating and also some manufacturing is moving overseas. So Mo Rubo and his wife, which is the same person we saw that was the young woman, his girlfriend in the earlier picture from Henan. They're married. They run a small business sourcing athletic apparel, and they have their own small brand, which none of us would have ever heard of, and not even most people in Beijing and Shanghai would know about. Not very easy, struggling to get by there. They have their office in their small apartment, which they rent. They can't afford to buy. During that visit, the big issue they were struggling with was what to do about the fourth person in the picture, their daughter who was turning 6, what to do about her education. And Mo Rubo was adamant that she would not go back and become a left behind child in the villages or in the townships near where he had grown up, but instead would go to school and live with them there in Dongguan in the city. And that very, very difficult because he already knew she wouldn't be able to go to the public schools. And that the alternative then was a small private school, of which there are many that have been created to cater to the migrant workers' kids. Not only are they typically of far poorer quality than the urban public schools, but they are also often very expensive.
Hey, Tiff. No, that was really great to see all these photos and that took you on the journey for the book. And I, of course, have been very fascinated by some of these issues. Just very quickly before we jump into the discussion, we had an interesting question from the audience that was asking you if you spoke Mandarin and whether you had any issues with a language barrier. And, you've been in China for 20 plus years and you probably speak Mandarin way better than I do. But I was going to say, part of venturing out into outside of Beijing and Shanghai and the big cities is that there's actually a different kind of Chinese spoken out there, right? There's a Guizhou and all the different dialects and things. It's actually quite a difficult process. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the village that I spent so much time in and that I write about in my book, Binghua Cun, actually is the people there are actually not the majority Han Chinese. They're an ethnic minority group, very small one called Bui, which many people have not heard of, and they have their own language. But they also, most of them do speak Mandarin. And there were several people, including Mo Rubo, typically migrant workers who had spent years outside the village that actually spoke quite standard Mandarin Chinese. So the fact that they had left as young people had really, all that time in the factories, they'd earned a little bit of money, but they'd actually also learned to speak Mandarin quite clearly. So that was not a challenge in that particular village. Some of the elderly people, I would actually need someone like Mo Rubo to serve as my translator, because they would speak a very, very thick version of Mandarin Chinese and be more comfortable in their own language. So that was the situation there. I have in other reporting in China, I've actually done local dialect to Mandarin translation. So for example, Chongqing has got a very strong accent. I actually hired a young person there who was someone who actually spoke very standard Mandarin, who also spoke the local dialect to not interpret into English, but into Mandarin.
Well, I think, yeah, I remember once thinking that, the difference between some place like Shanghai and some of these small villages is about as far a gap as you could imagine between, say, London and Lhasa, for example, in terms of the inequality, but also the language and the customs. And I think that's something that people outside of China don't necessarily understand. We all think because there's a standardized written system and Putonghua is spoken all across, that somehow it's much more uniform than we imagine. But I guess what I really found so fascinating about your book was, the central tenet of, we're very used to outside of China seeing China as this great economic miracle, the rising tides, the 300, 400 million people lifted out of poverty, so to speak. And your book sort of pulls back the curtain a little bit and sort of shows that, that's really quite not the case because of these two fundamental, huge iron bands that sort of keep migrant folks they're both tethered to the land that they might have left like 20, 30 years ago and probably don't even know how to farm, but they can't sell it. But at the same time, they can't fully assimilate into any of the bigger cities because they can't get any of the benefits that are accrued as a city resident. They can't send their kids to school. They can't get a medical system. The message is come here, work, power our economic engine, and then go back home, right? But this situation, as you describe it, is to some extent changing, right? And that's partly because the great economic engine that China has been powered on for a long time, which is cheap labor, is no longer the case. As you mentioned, automation is happening. So isn't there some sort of a huge push to change the way things are? Or is there some tension because of the way to keep things the way they are?
That's a very good question. I think there is, China is undergoing an economic shift that I would argue is as probably as big as you have to go back to Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening to find such a big shift. And that's really this move from the factory to the world model, as you say, based on low cost labor, producing goods mainly for export to the world, and for now to a much more domestic market driven economy, an economy driven by the service industries rather than manufacturing and investment. And this is happening very quickly in China. I would say that the 2-year trade war with the US plus COVID-19 has really brought home to the Chinese officials that this transition needs to happen much more quickly than before. And they've been talking about it for probably at least a decade that they must undergo this transition. They've seen wages go up. Average manufacturing wages today in China are actually higher than in Mexico or Malaysia. And so on the one hand, they've tried to automate their factories. And they've been quite successful. On the other hand, they really are trying to push this much more domestic market-driven economy. So they know that they have to make this transition. As I argue in my book, they face this really, until today, seemingly insurmountable obstacle, which is the fact that they have these policies in place that ensure that about 1/2 the population aren't on a path to become middle-class consumers. You have a situation that economists call precautionary savings, which is a big problem in China. Migrant workers in particular feel that their futures, and they're right, I think, are precarious. They have to, as I said, pay for their children to go to schools, private schools that are expensive in the cities, or their children send them back to the countryside. On the healthcare side, they live in fear of having a medical emergency that they won't necessarily get covered because they need to be back in their villages where they probably couldn't get good care in order to get proper coverage. So what you see is a very high savings rate across China, and therefore the flip side, low domestic consumption. So China's got about, just quickly on to get into the economic weeds here, China's been struggling to lift domestic consumption as a proportion of its overall economy for years now. It's stuck just below 40%. That's far lower than the global average. And so they know that they need to change that. Then you get to the issue of why aren't they reforming these policies? And there's a bunch of different reasons we can talk about later.
Yeah, well, we will get into that in a little bit, but I had an interesting question from a reader, which is pertaining to that last picture you showed of the Mo family. They said that Mo Rubo and his wife had to send the little girl to a private school because she doesn't have the residency papers to get into the local schools, and that's way more expensive. And he was kind of curious about what kind of a relative perspective on this cost would be relative to income, so we could get some idea. Do you want to talk about that or rent? I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, their income is very variable because they have this small business and they have good months and they have bad months. And it was tough. I would have to say it's been tough for them to ensure that they pay their rent, which is quite a modest apartment, which is where they have their office as well. But it's expensive in places like Dongguan now, far more expensive than when he went there as a young factory worker. So they have the rent. It could be, again, it's variable depending on what sort of business they've done that particular month. But it could easily be, the tuition could be a multiple of monthly rent.
Yeah. And I think if I'm correct on this, Tiff, because it's been a couple of years since I was in China reporting, but the part of the problem isn't so much also the cost, but then you're kind of going in the under the table, not fully, state sanctioned kind of a school system. Migrant kids are going to these, kind of to the side kind of schools. So the problem becomes later on is they don't have the right kind of school certification to progress at the higher levels and maybe even get into college, right? Relative to if they were going to a state sanctioned public school in the right areas, right? So that's a problem. You're paying through the nose for inferior education that's under the table that isn't really going to equip you to climb that ladder, right? Is that
absolutely the case? The way the system works in China, those children that do stay with their parents in the cities pretty much have to go back to the countryside when they're getting ready for high school. And for both the SATs, because that's the requirement that they take those tests. China is a very test-based system, as you know, and in order to get into high school and then to get into a good college, you have to take the test where you're officially registered. So those children often, right before high school, will go back and try to get into a rural high school. And interestingly, in some cases, they find that they're actually not as well prepared as the children that have stayed behind, because they are in these private schools that aren't very good. What it means in effect is there's an extremely high dropout rate, much higher than the Chinese government likes to admit. But there's been some very good research by different scholars, in particular, Scott Rozelle at Stanford, looking at what's the true dropout rate for rural kids in China. And it's very high. And it has to do with that fact, the lack of good preparation in these small.
So it's kind of a conundrum, right? You either, if you're a migrant worker, you have to go to the big city to probably get some kind of a job and be financially viable to support your children. But you either have the choice of leaving them behind and then, all the social economic problems because they're unsupervised, or you bring them with you, but then they get substandard education and they don't progress in a way that you'd hope. Right. I mean, there's so many heartbreaking stories about all these kids who are left behind. And there was a case of suicide, or their grandparents can't supervise them because, it's a very different system, or dropout rates are huge, or in some cases, even if they do stay behind, it's not necessarily clear that the path to schooling is better because the parents aren't there to keep an eye on them and to make sure that the developmental phases are. I mean, I've heard of some stories where they say, the kids, the left behind children, the problem, the plight is they are not actually gaining the skill sets that would even enable them to get the kind of jobs that their parents would be able to get in a factory, because it's 3 steps back in a way, right? Yeah, I'm sure you have a ton of really interesting stories like that when you talk to the Moors and all these other folks, right?
Yeah, I think there's a real serious problem. What China's done over the last 10, 15 years is close a lot of the small village schools, which were admittedly of very poor quality. And what they've done is create these big impersonal boarding schools. The idea is good, that they will sort of, they'll concentrate the scarce resources, and they'll have more migrant kids or rural kids getting access to the few good teachers out there. And that they'll perhaps have better meals because they'll be eating in a cafeteria. And there's been a fair amount of money put in by the central government as well into trying to build up the physical infrastructure of these boarding schools. But the reality is, I spent quite a bit of time visiting these boarding schools. And the reality is, whereas the physical facilities might be okay, or even in some cases good, they'll have sports grounds and so on, the soft infrastructure of teaching, issues of psychological problems that they face being away from their parents. Typically, they'll see their parents once a year when their parents come back for the Lunar New Year. None of these issues are dealt with. And there are as I said earlier, very high dropout rates from these big boarding schools as well.
So what we've discussed so far seems like a very internal issue, right? These are China's problems. China has in effect created a second-class citizenship where their migrants in a way are sort of internal immigrants that never can belong or assimilate within the greater system. Now, to some of our audience, to maybe probably most of our audience who, are from outside of China, how does this relate in a global economic scale? I mean, what are some of the spillover effects that could affect, say, U.S.-China relations, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I referring to the title of my book, and I'm often asked, what is the myth of Chinese capitalism? I'm really it's shorthand for a couple different myths. And one myth, to my mind, is the fact that this very impressive economic reform that we've seen going on for years is still continuing at the pace that it was before. And I argue that it really has stalled under the present leadership and Xi Jinping. Another related myth, which is very important to the world, is that China will continue to generate more and grow its middle class and have an ever larger middle class. And I think this is a myth that that the world's multinationals have become, first of all, believe and have become very reliant on. This idea that the growth that they've been accustomed to, which has been very impressive, and the market growth, the markets that they've been able to tap ever larger, will continue on this trajectory. And I don't think without these reforms, you're going to see that. So I think we're going to see a stalling of the middle class. On a country scale, much of the world has become accustomed to China being the growth driver. And again, without reform of these policies and real changes to the economy, I don't see that continuing. And that, of course, has implications for the global economy and companies around the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you're describing is a situation that would, I think, to some folks suggest that there's huge discontentment and, potentially huge unemployment issues. And then, which leads to the question about social, uprisings or changes. For a long time, many people assumed that once China opened up economically, that China would become like the West. They would demand democratic reforms. They would want more freedoms. Now we're clearly seeing that that isn't the case, and China is going to be whatever China is going to be. But then the question about what we're talking about, therefore, with discontentment, with low employment, they typically seem to be a recipe for problems which will could result in social uprisings or anything. But do you think that's also a myth potentially, or what would the crystal ball show potentially?
Well, I think the myth is that the urban middle class, the well-educated urban middle class, is going to become a source of social change, and this sort of the NIMBY idea, not in my backyard, that you do well, you get educated, you buy an apartment, and the factory goes up across the way, and you say, there was no public consultation before this factory was built. We need a real political system that doesn't surprise us with things like that. I think that is a myth, and that was something that certainly in my earlier years in China seemed to be sort of a given. This idea that with economic growth, particularly urban China and well-educated China, would become a source of political change. And of course, this is what we heard from US politicians, Bill Clinton and others, when the decision was made to bring China into the World Trade Organization. This was quite explicit, that with time, political change would follow economic change. And there has been no evidence of that happening at all. I think one of the reasons we all got it wrong, and I put myself in that group as well, was that you miss this real reality in China, which I would argue a defining contract between the government and the party and the people has been not always said explicitly, but very important, which is we, the party, will guarantee that your living standards will continue to rise, and you, the people, will not demand real civil rights. You won't demand a free press, and you will accept the fact that you have one party ruling all, the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that bargain has been very effective in effect, buying off, if you will, political aspirations or ideals of the better off people in China. I think that bargain was already fraying significantly for migrant workers and for rural people in China. For the reasons I just said, migrant workers have done, and rural people have done far more poorly than the rest of the population. And I do think that there is a growing awareness and that this is the case, and that it's happening because of a structural system, the hukou system and the land system. And I think that's something, when I first started reporting, most rural people and migrants were unaware of, but I think today they are quite aware of it.
So, but with that level of rising discontent, people have likened that social contract or that bargain as a bicycle that has to keep moving, otherwise it's going to fall over one way or the other. But it sounds like, as far as migrant workers are concerned, that bicycle momentum is slowing down. If so, there's the potential for some tilt or not. Do we throw that out of the window too? What?
I do think that this is a really this is a challenging time for the Chinese government. The Chinese government's desire to continue without any hiccups in its control. And they're very aware of that. If you look at speeches and so on, they're very aware that this transition is a very difficult one. There is more uncertainty in the lives of migrant workers now in China than there has been in over 20 years since I first moved there. They are, in many cases, being strongly encouraged to leave the cities and go back to the villages of the countryside. The idea being that they can reinvent themselves as small entrepreneurs. In Guizhou, which I spent so much time in, the push is to create sort of ecotourism because it's a beautiful, relatively untouched by industry province. And so they're hoping to that these migrants can go back and create little bed and breakfasts in their villages and attract urban people with money to come vacation. But everyone's trying to do that in Guizhou. There's way too much supply of these small bed and breakfasts. So I think there's this real uncertainty about what happens next. The other big employment path forward, at least in the government's perspective, is the service industry. We see a couple of years ago, there's actually more migrants working in the service industry than there are in manufacturing and construction, which is a big shift from before. The problem is, and there's more and more of these, most of these jobs that the migrants now are doing are very low end and often, maybe not even as good as the factory jobs. So the very common one, which is a brutal
delivery,
job,
right? The gig economy, yeah.
There's been some great reporting out of China recently, including by NPR, about that. It's a brutal job. If they get fined all the time for not delivering quickly, similar to what happens in the United States, actually. And this is the main job that migrant workers are now doing as they leave the factory jobs, and that's a very, very difficult source of employment.
So, do you think there's any chance and possibility that there will be significant changes to the hukou system? I mean, you've outlined certainly humanitarian reasons why it shouldn't be there, but do you think there might be, Well,
it's interesting. I think that this is the time, if there ever was one, when the Chinese government needs to reform the hukou system. And they, I should say, know that. I mean, they've been talking at least for the last 7 years, they've been talking about the need to reform the hukou system, specifically to bring more of rural and migrant people into the consumer economy and try to make this transition to a much more domestic market-driven economy. As I said earlier, right now with the global trade frictions, particularly with the US, with what's happened with COVID-19, China is very aware that it needs to much more rely on the spending power of its own people. So they need to make that move. They've been talking about reforming the hukou for a very long time, however. And to date, what they've done has been not very ambitious at all. There's been piecemeal programs, pilot cities that have been opened where migrants.
Cities, many of them, right?
Typically these places are not necessarily those places that have strong local economies or might be attractive to the migrant workers. So you see a situation where the sort of this chicken and egg dilemma, where the Chinese government says, here's a city that has a lackluster economy. Maybe it's one of these so-called ghost cities where there's too much empty residential apartments that haven't sold. This is a perfect place to have a larger population influx. They open that to hukou reform for the migrant workers, but there's no jobs there. And there's this idea somehow that the migrants are going to come in and I don't know how, gather enough money to buy a local apartment and somehow find a job. And that's not really how it works. Many of the cities that are the most attractive, the big showcase
Shanghai,
cities,
Beijing,
they're
Guangzhou.
actually restricting. They're actually physically driving out the migrant workers. One of their most common tactics is to shut down these small private schools that cater to the migrant children. And then the parents don't have a place to put their children in school. But both Beijing and Shanghai have actually set population growth targets, which are actually reduction. So they're trying to reduce the total number of people in those cities. And the way that they do it typically is to get rid of the migrant population.
I remember at the time they used to sell those hukous on the black market, and they used to be like really expensive, right? You had a Beijing hukou, it could be anywhere, like you could sell it for $100,000 or something at that time. And I remember when I was researching my book about the one-child policy and going to one of these like dating scenarios just to see how people were doing it. And all the Beijing guys, all they would go in and they'll be like, I have Beijing hukou, therefore I am so desirable and a big and I'm pretty sure that's probably the case still, right, Tiff?
I think it is. Some of it's my understanding is the market's been limited by Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption, and also the fact that they are very serious now about actually reducing the numbers of people in some of these big cities. But yes, it was a vibrant market, very expensive to buy a hukou. A lot of college students that had come to places like Beijing and Shanghai, but then didn't have a job with a state enterprise and didn't have anyone to marry to get a hukou, which is typically a way to get an urban hukou, would then actually buy these on the black market.
This is an interesting question that sort of came up, by the way, about unemployment and whether or not Jack Ma has, enabled, by enabling, Jack Ma is the founder of Alibaba, which is kind of like a version of, China's Amazon plus supersized. And so what it's done is enable a lot of online shipping to rural parts. So this reader's question is, has that, enabled any economic improvements or enabled, probably migrants to stay where they are and decentralize the whole emphasis on Beijing and Shanghai? Any thoughts on that one, Tiff?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the most notable thing that it has done is created this new industry of delivery people, which is a brutal industry. They do earn money there. Sometimes it's comparable to what they'd earn in the factories, but it's a very brutal job to do. So that's one thing it's done. It's created this enormous new ecosystem of delivery jobs. In the countryside, there is a phenomena which not only Alibaba, but the World Bank has touted of these so-called Taobao villages. Taobao being the company that belongs to Alibaba.
Sort of like eBay, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And what it has allowed, in many cases, industry to go into the countryside, and indeed, in some cases, migrant workers would have jobs working much closer to where they grew up. In these little Taobao villages. And they've gone there, however, for the obvious reason that costs are lower and regulatory issues are, if they still exist, they can be ignored. So what I saw, which was very interesting, in some of these Taobao villages, which I spent some time in, is on the one hand, yes, it's providing jobs in rural China for migrant workers, which is a good thing. On the other hand, I saw in some cases a return of some of these very questionable, I would call them sweatshop practices that I had written about in the late 90s, early 2000s in China, which we saw sort of disappear in places like Dongguan, or at least in most cases go away as costs went, as wages went up, as the global sweatshop anti-sweatshop lobby started to put pressure on the big labels. Some of this stuff started to disappear. But in any case, we're seeing some of that reappear now, where workers are not being paid according to the labor law, and environmental regulations are being skirted in these Taobao villages. So it's really a mixed picture.
This is an interesting question from the audience. I'm not quite sure how you're going to answer this one, Tiff, but I'll lob it at you. I think this is partly prompted by all the interest in what's going on in Hong Kong recently, particularly with the arrest of some of the young labor activists, Joshua and some Wong and some of the other ones that I think just happened today or yesterday. So this question is, how much influence in the political economic landscape of China does these recent changes in the Hong Kong relationship with the PRC have on this whole myth of Chinese capitalism?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure this is the question, but I think an interesting point to make is that there's always been, and I think even amongst the Chinese leadership, this fear that unrest in Hong Kong will seep into China, and that it'll be an example for activists within China. I don't see that happening now. In most cases, I think the Chinese government has been quite successful in making it a very nationalistic issue. I think your average Chinese in the mainland probably feels resentment towards the protesters in Hong Kong. And they also have been fed a lot of misinformation about just how violent the Hong Kong protesters are. The Chinese media has focused, the state-controlled media, on presenting this picture of violent young people in Hong Kong that are wreaking, chaos and havoc in this beautiful coastal place that, in China's mind, of course, belongs to China and Chinese people's mind. So there is. I don't think that's happening. I do think that the unrest in Hong Kong is tremendously worrying, is a tremendous source of worry for the Communist Party. I think their sovereignty above all is an issue that animates them, going back to their history of almost becoming colonized during the treaty port era 100 years ago. They talk about the century of national humiliation back when they were almost colonized. So sovereignty, losing control of parts of China, is a huge issue. I think that quickly that the decision to implement such a draconian national security law, it reflects that. I think that the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping knew that the national security law would be, it might bring more Hong Kong people to the streets, that there would be a strong reaction globally, including from the US, and China made the calculation that it was worth it because they are so concerned and so worried about losing control over this key part of China. They decided we're going to go in really heavy-handed and institute this new law.
So Tiff, I mean, we've had a really good chat at this point about a lot of things which have been sort of burbling under the surface of China for quite a while. You've been there for 20 years. You sort of see this whole arc. But one of the things we haven't discussed, which is the thing that's basically shaped our whole reality in the last year, which is the pandemic, coronavirus, right? How has this sort of accentuated or changed any of the themes in your book?
Yeah, well, I should note that nowhere in my book, of course, is the pandemic mentioned. My book came out in the spring, in March. I was in New York City. I saw my planned book activities. Unfortunately, some of them canceled or delayed, and I had to leave New York early because there was the realization right then that actually this was a serious problem in New York as well. So nowhere in my book do I mention the pandemic. I would argue that the themes that I deal with in my book, the challenges of inequality, the necessity to try to move forward on reforming these policies are only more obvious in light of the pandemic. What we've seen so far in China, if you look at the economy to date, obviously during the first quarter of this year, negative growth, real hit to the Chinese economy. We've seen in the second and third quarters a remarkable rebound. I think in the third quarter it was 4.9% GDP growth, and that is remarkable and admirable, and is frankly a credit to China's ability in controlling the virus. But if you look more closely at the growth, you will see that actually much of it is being driven by investment. It's very lopsided. If you look at consumer spending in China, it's been much more focused on, or much more active when you look at higher end goods and higher income people. So you've seen a surge in sales of things like SUVs and luxury handbags. All that's back in China. But if you look at actually sort of mass market sales, it's actually been quite lackluster. And that is a reflection of the fact that a very large portion of the Chinese people are, if not out of work, and many migrants are still out of work, are facing real questions about whether they're going to have a job in the following month. So you see this lopsided recovery, which I would argue is just yet another reason why China needs to reform these policies, the hukou policy and the dual land policy, and put the economy on a more sustainable footing.
Okay, we've only got time for one last question. Unfortunately, this has been so great talking to you on this, but this is a question that, which I'm trying to wrap in quite a few of these, as well as my own interests, and sort of round it off, which, there's a lot of people asking about the big question about what, which is still whether democracy would work for China, and, whether what Chinese have seen with what's happened with the Trump administration here has affected, the whole US-China relations, and what does this mean for the future. And I want to wrap this in with my question, which is, Tiff, you spent 20 years in China reporting, being on the ground there, and coming up with all these great nuggets and stories, which can only be done really when you're there, when you've been there. But of course, and this is related to the whole fraying of the US-China relations, we're there are very few correspondents, foreign correspondents. China is increasingly kicking out many foreign correspondents. They have been doing so. It's increasingly hard to operate as a foreign correspondent in China. You've seen that over the years. So I guess the big question here is, what does this mean for the future? Are we going to see a reset maybe with Biden back in Biden with the Biden administration, or are we going to see a continued fraying? What are some of these lessons learned? What is the future potentially with? Are we going to see more, less? What do you think? What is lost?
On the question of the journalist issue, the journalist expulsions, I think actually one of the things that I hope the Biden administration does is back away from this sort of tit for tat game that's been going on, where China expels, or the U.S. expels some Chinese journalists or limits their visa duration, typically declaring the Chinese journalists as state media or state actors. And then China responds by kicking out Western journalists. I think this is very bad. I think it's key to have, in both countries, to have Chinese journalists, no matter whether in some cases they, what their relationship might be with the party, and also have foreign journalists in China writing about China. So I think that needs to happen. In terms of a possible reset, I do think that we're going to see some nice words on both sides. I think it's likely that the Biden administration will take a much less sort of, I would almost call aggressive approach that we've seen under the Trump administration. I guess Biden said yesterday in a New York Times interview that he's not going to immediately lift the tariffs that Trump has imposed, but it wouldn't surprise me if those are downplayed or eventually lifted. Some of the technology restrictions that haven't actually necessarily been instituted anyway, that the Trump administration has announced, the ban on TikTok, for example, which they keep giving them one more week, hasn't actually happened. I think it's even less likely that those bans will be carried out. So that's all good, I think. I do think, and this is an important point in my mind, what we've seen an election in just one of these two capitals, right, in Washington. And I think in Beijing, we've seen it made very clear that, that the leader in charge has no intention of going anywhere. He even changed the constitution so that there are no term limits, so that he can stay on for many, many years. He also at the recent, he still has not, there's been no hint as to who the successors of Xi Jinping would be. Typically at this point we would know. So he's not going anywhere. I think the ball, if you will, is just as much in Beijing's court to try to improve the relationship. And so I expect, whereas we'll see some improvements, I don't expect any sort of reset at all. I think the tensions between the two countries are still very much there, and don't see any evidence that they're going to go away.
Well, globally as well, I do wonder as well. I mean, like if, the rest of the world is sort of wondering, seeing China rising and they're seeing the US, particularly this handling of COVID and so on forth, sort of falling down in its global leadership positioning. And, do you think, for example, the elections might have potentially changed that? Okay, there's Biden's coming in. Or do you think that, they look, okay, Xi Jinping is going to be around for quite a foreseeable amount of future. What we've seen from the U.S. exercise in democracy is this is not as strong as we think it is, and it's very volatile. Who knows, Trump could be back again in 2024. Let's make our bets accordingly with Beijing as the big brother and investments and following through and all these other things. What do you think of that whole thinking?
There's some truth to that, I guess, but I would also point out that China hasn't just created ill will with the United States, and the U.S. created ill will with China, but there's a lot of ill will between a lot of different countries around the world and China. I mean, look what's happening in Australia, which in effect, China's threatened the trading relationship because of, I guess, initially because Australia had the temerity to ask for a global, an independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19. Well, China, in a very sort of ham-fisted way, has threatened Australian threatened Australia, and certainly, and its exports of wine and beef and barley and so on. So I think right now, all reports, the people of Australia are very upset with China, and you can extend that to India, where we saw a bloody border clash. The list goes on. I do think that one thing that might happen under Biden, which is very good and I think is overdue, is sort of a restoration of some of our relationships with our allies, including in Asia, with Japan and South Korea, maybe get closer to some non-traditional allies like Vietnam. And that actually, I think, will put more pressure on China, and it would work as sort of a counter trend to what you mentioned, this idea that countries will say, well, Xi Jinping's not going away, we better get used to it and accept the relationship as it is.
Well, I wish we could have more time to just chat on about all this. This has been such a great conversation. It's been so good to see you again, Tiff. I really want to thank you for giving us the time to have this great, important conversation. And I also want to tell members of the audience to please purchase Tiff's book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, wherever books are sold. And the club will soon be posting this video along on its website. So that's www.commonwealthclub.org. So thank you guys very much for this very stimulating conversation that we've had. And best of luck. Tiff, it's always great to see you. Take care.
Likewise. Thanks so much, man.